The modern narrative is that women are somehow second-class citizens in our society, that it's a very patriarchal society, that women are denied all manner of opportunities that are open to the men. But is that really so? I'm going to be talking to men who have considered themselves the victims of injustice, whether it's men just wanting to pursue a career and coming up against quotas and all-women shortlists, whether it's men who want nothing more than just to be able to see their own children, often in accordance with a court order, but cannot do so. Men who've been pursued for money they don't even owe by the child maintenance service, including in one case resulting in a suicide. And men who've been the subject of the most horrendous allegations, including rape, and who find that right from the outset, the scales of justice are weighted against them. I'm Anne Widdecombe. I've been in frontline politics for over 30 years, and during that time the fight for women's equality has been one of the ongoing narratives. But now I cannot help but feel that this has been somewhat at the expense of men, who are increasingly at a disadvantage in family matters and in defending themselves against accusations of what is called toxic masculinity. Too often it's men who are on the back foot. In this programme, I want to investigate some of the more pressing aspects of the anti-male agenda. When Alison Saunders ran the Crown Prosecution Service, there was an outcry because the police were found not to have shared vital information with defence lawyers, information which clearly exonerated the accused. This was felt by many to be the result of undue political pressure from the top, and Saunders stood down at the end of her term. As a consequence, it was decided to review every single rape and assault case, and no fewer than 47 were halted. But that still left those who had been convicted already. Even if you are acquitted, it is still okay to question your innocence, as I found out when I talked to Mark, a serving police officer, who spent 4 years suspected of a sexual crime he did not commit, but who still hasn't been allowed to return to work, despite being found innocent by a jury.
So in March 2017, I was initially arrested after a false allegation was made that I had sexually assaulted an ex-girlfriend's daughter, who was 9 at the time that we were together. And then following on from that was a series of further allegations, false allegations, stemming from my ex-girlfriend herself and a couple of my ex-girlfriend's friends to create a case against me that eventually resulted in me going to trial in August this year, 2021, and then subsequently being acquitted.
So it took 4 years to come to trial?
4 years and a bit, yeah. 4
years during which presumably you weren't allowed to work?
I was on restricted duties initially at work. I wasn't charged until January 2020. So there was the investigation for the first 3 years or so, and then after charge I was suspended, and I remain suspended to this day.
Presumably they called you a perpetrator right from the start?
They did.
And the accuser was the victim?
That's how it was.
In their terminology?
How it was done, yes.
Yeah. And so presumably you've been reinstated?
No, I remain suspended to this day.
Why?
There's now an internal investigation where they look at whether there are any disciplinary issues for which they want to deal with and or dismiss me.
So even though you've been acquitted,
yes,
and completely acquitted,
yes,
and acquitted pretty quickly,
yes,
you're still suspended and you're still not able to simply pick up your life where it left off?
No, and I can't make any commitments at the moment because I don't know if I'm going to have a job in 3 months.
Why do you think your ex did this?
I think it was mostly bitterness and jealousy. The allegation came about within a week of her finding out that I was with a new partner, and I think there was a little bit of financial motivation there as well.
She hoped for compensation?
I think so, yeah.
And of course your accuser remains anonymous?
Indeed she does.
Were you in the papers?
I was in the papers, yeah, on several occasions.
And so for 4 years some people would have thought you were probably guilty?
Yeah, I lost quite a few friends, friends who I genuinely would have taken a bullet for at 3 o'clock in the morning at a dangerous incident, and then all of a sudden they were gone.
First of all, why does it take so long? Secondly, why do you think the police always automatically assume the woman is telling the truth?
I think in recent years there's been such a push towards increasing the level of charges and convictions that I think that the policies are in place to say, unless there is overwhelming evidence that drops in your lap, you will pursue this matter as though she is telling the truth and the person that you're dealing with is guilty.
So the police would have prepared a report for the Crown Prosecution Service.
Yeah.
Why do you suppose the Crown Prosecution Service decided to go ahead?
Well, my personal opinion, obviously I've not seen all of the paperwork that was exchanged, but my personal opinion is that because the investigation takes on a one-sided tilt that I am guilty and that she is telling the truth, then of course what is presented to the Crown Prosecution Service has that tilt to it. So therefore they make the decision based on what they're told, which may not, I think, be the full story because it doesn't have the full balance.
Do you think that perhaps the police do understand that something doesn't really stand up, but send it to the CPS anyway because of the conviction rate?
I think that's the most likely explanation, yeah. I think it's very unlikely that a seasoned detective who would be dealing with serious sexual offences would not be able to spot serious gaps in the evidence. And it felt to me as though the only reason this was being pushed forward was because of the conviction rate and also possibly because of my job. I wonder, if I worked for the post office or stacking shelves at the local shop, whether I would have even been charged in the first place. In relation to my family, because of the allegations and the nature of the allegations in relation to my ex's daughter, over the last 4 years, a combined period of over 18 months, I wasn't able to see my own children. The longest of those periods was 10 months.
Your own children?
My own children.
So you as a policeman have been on the other end of the justice system for several years. Did you feel that the system itself was fair, or did you feel that it was stacked against you from the start?
I felt it was stacked against me from the start, and it knocked my confidence a bit because I've been in the police for 20 years and I know that these investigations are supposed to be done in an independent fashion, and it really didn't feel like that to me.
So you felt that the justice system itself was stacked against you. How do you feel the sort of the public debate is going about rape?
I think that there's an issue that when they're saying we need to increase convictions, that can lead us down a very dodgy rabbit hole, in that we are effectively saying that people should be going to prison regardless of whether they are guilty or not for the cause, and I don't think that's okay. I think there are a lot of people who do understand that false allegations exist, but I feel like the overarching narrative at the moment is to treat false allegations as acceptable casualties.
It's not just in the area of sexual assaults where the courts appear to disadvantage men in certain respects. In family and custody matters too, many men feel they face an uphill struggle to achieve justice and fair access to their own children. Children need fathers, but the law can make it quite hard for some men to play a part in their lives, no matter how much they want to. Women who block the father's access, however, seem to pay no penalty. It's almost as though the law regards involved fatherhood as an optional extra. One such dad is Noel Wilcox, a serving soldier. Noel, your situation, as I understand it, is that you had a child as a result of a very brief fling, and you didn't know anything about that child until you were contacted by the Child Support Agency. When you investigated, you found that yes, she was indeed your child, and she was growing up in a house where there was a man and a woman, where the man had quite a substantial criminal record, and the other 3 children were their children. You said, right, fine, she's my child. You came to an agreement in terms of money. You came to an agreement in terms of access. It was all on the surface perfectly amicable. Mm-hmm. And then, from the age of 9 months until really the age of 9, it was very much an on-off business in which you would have access and then suddenly it was stopped. Mm-hmm. You spent tens of thousands of pounds in the courts trying to get regular access. You were worried about your daughter because of the milieu in which she was growing up. Every so often it started again and then stopped. And eventually the child herself was saying that she didn't want to see you. Mm-hmm. And then finally you discovered that social services were claiming that it was you who was the risk to the child.
That's correct, yes.
Despite the fact you hadn't actually been seeing the child at that stage for about 2 years.
No.
You haven't seen her really since she was 6.
That's correct.
And you have decided, as I suspect quite a few men do, it's just not worth carrying on.
That's correct. For your own mental health.
So one would automatically say, well, hang on, you'd agreed access. In fact, at several points you've got access orders. Mm-hmm. What did the judge say when you went back and said, I'm not being allowed to see the child?
The judge, numerous times, would always find that the mother was in breach of the court orders, but he would never enforce those orders.
What was his reason for not enforcing them?
They never gave you a reason as to why they wouldn't enforce those orders. He would just say that's my decision and that's final.
So what it seems to me is that the courts decide what should happen. Mm-hmm. What they don't decide is what does happen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
That's entirely down to the mother.
That's entirely down to the mother. Yeah.
So the courts say, yes, this is the access order. Yes, we confirm that access order. Yes, this is what should happen. Yes, this is what is in the best interest of the child. But oh, by the way, we're not going to make it happen.
That's correct. I mean, what I would say, how I would sort of summarise it, is that because it's a human right to give a father contact to that child, they do give you that contact. However, they will make it so extremely difficult for you to have contact with that child. And the mother will always know what that system is, and she will know the buzzwords of what to say to the judge and how to make it so difficult. So she would always say to the judge, oh, it's quite simple. The child didn't want to see him. That's why we didn't go to contact that time. And the judge would accept that with absolutely...
Didn't Kafkas interview the child?
Kafkas did interview the child, yeah. And they would say that they've done these kind of games with the child which would draw out the child's feelings and views on things. And in the Kafkas report, which was a Section 7 report, so the judge did initiate a Section 7 report because contact wasn't happening.
Yes.
So the judge wanted to find out why.
So the judge went that far, yeah.
Wanted to find out why contact wasn't happening. And when I read the Section 7 report, I mean, I was just horrified at, what I had read, in terms of the allegations that had been made against me, about what my daughter was saying about me as well. Bearing in mind, this is a daughter that I saw very, very rarely, with a lot of very fragile contact as such, So I couldn't understand why my daughter was making these claims. Yeah. And she was saying things such as Daddy Noel, because that's what she used to call me, Daddy Noel.
Yeah.
He's using the courts to bully my mother. So quite
clearly... How could a child work that out? Yeah.
So quite clearly I could tell from the Kafkas report that, she was discussing court proceedings with my daughter. And it was all these sorts of things that were just never addressed by Kafkas or the judge. In fact, I've got to be honest with you, the judge did, because of the amount of parental alienation that was going on, he did make a separate order saying that if the mother continues making defamatory comments about the father, he did make a separate order to that effect. But it never carried any weight because the mother knows that any order that a judge makes, it's never going to be enforced and they're never going to do anything about it.
You said to me, referring to your time in the services, you said, I've dodged bullets and bombs for this, and what does it come to?
Yeah, you know, the best of us are given no support by the family courts, by CAFCAS, by social services, but then it seems that the worst of us, and I'm not saying that people who don't work are the worst of us, are given so much preferential treatment to the fathers that do work. And if it's used against you in court that you serve your country, that you work hard for a living, then what sort of country have we become that a judge or the judiciary system or the family courts would take that view, that a father who works hard is any less of a father than a father who doesn't work?
But why do they take the view that a father is less of a parent than the mother?
Exactly. Why do they?
Surely it's in the child's interest that there are two parents on the scene.
It is in the child's best interest that there's both parents, and research has, you know, proven that. And when you hear about, you know, all the knife crime that there is in London and, you know, the amount of criminality that there is, you know, it always boils back down to the fact that, you know, a lot of these hardened criminals that have gone to prison have had a parent not in their life. A lot more, it's a father that hasn't been in their life. And I just think, you know, how many children need that role model? I think you're absolutely right, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the lack of transparency is that is what is crippling, you know, the whatever agenda CAFCAS have, whatever agenda the family courts have, whatever agenda social services have, whatever their hidden agenda is, they can get away with it because it's not open to public scrutiny. And this is the problem. And until we get the family courts transparent, you know, this is just going to go on and on and on. And ultimately, it's children's lives, to me, that look like that they're kind of used as weapons against the state. You know, it's this, you know, when a case is very simple, it seems to be so overcomplicated. And that, to me, is unacceptable.
And among other things that you discovered from social services was that there had been allegations against you of domestic violence. Did you ever have an opportunity to refute those allegations? No,
I immediately complained regarding, you know, the allegations of domestic violence, and the fact that when it goes to a child protection plan, there then becomes a chairman who apparently coordinates all the intelligence among different agencies such as the police, you know, the social worker that's working with the child and stuff like that. And because of her attitude and the way that she was towards me, and her bias towards a father, when I was challenging them on the decisions that they were making, and when I put the complaint in that she had put in red that I was the biggest risk to my daughter, obviously I challenged it. I then received a phone call from her probably about 6 weeks afterwards, when there was another conference that was going ahead, and she said, you're not invited to that conference. And I said, well, I have every right to be there.
Of course.
I said, that's my daughter and I have every right. She said, let me tell you, Mr. Wilcox, you have no rights. That's exactly what she said to me.
So the person responsible for deciding your daughter's future, the person who was coordinating the efforts of all the various agencies and gathering it all together, with the laughable title of child protection, that person said to you, Mr. Wilcox, you have no rights.
That's exactly what she said.
Just about sums it up, doesn't it?
Shockingly, it is not just the non-residential parents who encounter this anti-male prejudice, as I found when I spoke to Vincent McGovern, who had been through a horrendous fight to see his own children, and he'd been bringing up those children full-time.
Vincent, you've got 3 children.
Correct.
And many years ago, your marriage began to fail, and your ex-wife was quite determined that you weren't going to see the children. Your ex-wife was a professional, she wasn't a stupid woman. So what happened?
Well, it all happened at once. It was an avalanche. I had no prior warning of the marriage failing, but unknown to me, she had been keeping a secret diary since we got married in preparation for my departure. And when the time came in 2007, and she decided to remove me from looking after the children, because I was the primary carer of them for 9 years.
You were the primary carer?
Correct, yes.
So you were a house husband, for want of a better term.
That's want of a better word,
Yep.
yes.
So you were bringing up the children?
Yes. 29 witness statements in court.
And that was so that your wife could pursue her profession?
And she was excellent at it, yes.
Right.
And she was also studying a lot as well. She increased her 21 more letters after her name. And income multiplied by 4. So it was all very successful in that part. And I was quite happy with that. I thought this was the future. I was foolish. So when she couldn't get rid of me by, shall we say, demanding I leave, a member of her staff assisted her with the local domestic violence agency in Brent, a section of Women's Aid, Brent Domestic Violence Advocacy Project, and they put together a package, shall we call it, and under their domestic violence corporate strategy, they will only accept evidence from female survivors of domestic abuse. So I was automatically labelled perpetrator. And when they informed her that there was insufficient evidence to get an injunction against me, they asked, have I ever abused animals? And she came up with a phantom dog. That I had.
A phantom dog?
My family call him Shadow.
But did this dog exist?
This dog never existed. We have 19 witness statements in court corroborating, but that was months later before I found out the evidence. And then Brent engaged in the MARIC process, Multiple Agency Risk Assessment Conference, where the verdict only on the evidence is brought to the attention of this conference. So I'd never seen this evidence. I only knew the verdict, which was that I was deemed a danger to the mother and the children, and that pending some domestic violence program lasting about a year, I shouldn't be allowed to see the children, based on my psychotic abuse of animals. That never existed.
Animal that never existed.
Of an animal that never existed. But he was very beneficial to getting me removed.
Well, now, before people come to those conclusions and make
Yes.
those sorts of rulings, presumably evidence is assessed, and somebody somewhere would have surely proved that this dog was a figment of an imagination. Did that happen?
No, because under Brent's domestic violence corporate strategy, the perpetrator must not be, their words, the perpetrator must not be informed of the evidence because he may endanger the survivor.
So let's sum that up. So a whole stack of allegations can be made against you.
Correct? Based on gender.
Or whatever. A whole stack of allegations can be made against you. And because you have been accused,
Correct?
they will hear no evidence from you.
Correct?
They will take into account no evidence from you.
Correct?
They won't let you be privy to the evidence that has been produced.
Correct?
And they will therefore automatically believe the complainant, in this case the woman.
That is a constitutional practice, as I established under freedom of information.
So, having got this under freedom of information, and having seen what the processes were,
Yeah?
did you challenge the process?
Many times.
And?
I was described in letter by the then Chief Executive of Brent Council, Garrett Daniel, as being tendentious for challenging this process.
Has there been an ombudsman's examination?
5, 3 parliamentary, but with findings in my favour throughout. But nobody would investigate that. That is not to be investigated, this process. Nobody wants to touch that.
Well, and while all this travesty of law was going on,
Yes?
you were not seeing your children?
When I was removed from the family home ex parte, means without notice, because the notes from the case conference and the verdict and the evidence led to a family court judge removing me from the family home with 4 other orders against me. I call it bogus justice and sham legality myself.
Yeah.
Then I wasn't allowed to see the children for a few months, which sickened me deeply and them. And I was booted from the
But
family home.
you've been bringing them up.
Yes,
So they go from a situation in which Dad's been bringing them up,
yes,
and suddenly Dad ain't there anymore. And what's more, they can't even visit him.
Well, not alone that, if a friend of mine or a relative were to wave at the children, I would be prosecuted for harassing and breaking the terms of the injunction on the evidence I hadn't even seen at that stage.
Now, how long did this process of challenge and counter-challenge go on?
A major part of the process was in the following February, when there was a 3-day finding of fact hearing. And that was a major platform in clearing me of all the allegations. In fact, the circuit judge said in her summation, I cannot see where this man was ever deemed a danger to his children. And that was a huge, huge relief to me. I mean, I'm not a saint.
Yeah.
I never would apply for sainthood. But the major problem I had at that time was the guardian from the court advisory service was deeply, could hardly see me without almost spitting at me, and did all she could to handicap any possibility of a relationship with the children. Fortunately, the court saw through that, to their great credit, and her entire lengthy, spurious evidence was effectively ignored by the judges, for which I'm eternally grateful.
So the story so far is you've had a lot of false allegations made against you.
Yes.
You've been separated from your children as a result of those allegations. Nevertheless, a court now believes you.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens from this point?
Well, then I became the non-resident parent.
Right.
And I was having what we call the default position, seeing the children every second weekend, half
Yes.
the holidays, plus another evening and an alternate Tuesday evening. So the courts were quite good in that circumstance. But it wasn't too long before the oldest boy didn't want to see me anymore, because he was under quite a bit of pressure. And when I sought to enforcement, I had the ridiculous order saying that the order won't be enforced, but it stands. There's a 98.7% failure to enforce court orders, as referenced by Suella Braverman, MP, former Attorney General in Hansard. So only 1.24% of applications for enforcement are successful by the non-resident parent. Once you're the non-resident parent, the system treats you as sub-dirt.
So let's just look at it this way. So you're a non-resident parent.
Correct.
You have an order.
Yes.
Committing both sides to access.
Correct.
The order is ignored by the other party.
Yeah.
Consistently ignored, not
Yes.
just once or twice, but
Yes.
consistently ignored. You apply for enforcement.
Correct.
And effectively, although the order is confirmed, nobody's going to do anything about enforcing it.
Absolutely correct.
So therefore, your ex-wife can continue to deny you access to the children, and nobody will do anything.
Well, yes. That happened with the two sons at different times in their life, because there are 5 years difference in ages. But that is the situation, yes.
Now, if you had 3 wishes with regard to the system of access to the children following breakup,
Yeah.
what would those 3 wishes be that the law should do that it does not do?
Remove the gender vigilantes in the gateway services.
So we remove the presumption of guilt, the presumption of perpetrator.
Automatic, yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes. Unless proven to criminal standard, of course.
Yeah.
Remove that. Copy what they do in most developed nations, which is the entire system is inquisitorial, not adversarial, which is a disaster for the children and the non-resident parent, and quite often the resident parent. And have a system that, like Finland, Scandinavia, and the developed nations, where post-divorcial separation, the contact with both parents and the wider families remains more or less consistent, no less than 35%, unless geography or other factors. But we have the worst of all systems in the UK, out of the 37 first world nations.
Your wishes are the removal of the presumption of guilt,
Yes.
enforcement of access arrangements, and that those arrangements should be determined by a different process which is not adversarial.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that all evidence should be available to both parties.
At all times. No vigilantes in the system.
Sure.
The allegation is deemed as evidence, and there are many feminist barristers who will insist that the father contesting that evidence is guilty of coercive and controlling behaviour. So by trying to defend yourself, and Kafka's guardian was very angry with me for getting statements rebutting the false allegations against me.
Yeah.
As a father, the non-resident parent, you are not allowed to defend yourself. And that is the situation now with regard to litigants in person under cross-examination of the accuser. That by cross-examining the accuser in court, you're subjecting her, the victim, to further emotional abuse. That's Practice Direction 12J. It is absolutely mind-boggling. But I've all long believed that a major part of the reason why the system exists the way it is because nobody outside the system will accept it or wants to accept how it is, because it's just staggering. Of course there are women brutally abused.
Yeah.
And there are men brutally abused. But we have a narrative now that only males can be perpetrators.
I think the reason for that is, I mean, I automatically think domestic violence, I would imagine the man inflicting it. For this reason, that if the woman inflicts it, the man is surely strong enough to resist it. Must be. I mean, if she's belting him, he can grab her hands.
That's right, and hold her.
Well, she can't do that to him.
By and large, absolutely correct. And there are 3 women, I believe, killed every week in the UK. But what the figure that we never hear about is the fact that there are about 900 fathers a year who commit suicide post-divorce or separation, because violence comes in many forms. Direct physical violence is only one of them. So when it comes to physical violence, men generally win that argument against women. That's absolutely without question. But it's not totally one-sided. The Office of National Statistics, published in February 2012, shows that women report 3 times as often as men are likely to for the same offence, and that males are 35 to 50% victims of domestic violence, but they won't pursue the complaint because you're quite often ridiculed if you do. I mean, I attempted to went domestic violence advocacy project in 2007 because I wanted to protect the children, and I also contacted the National Domestic Violence Agency. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has deemed it is absolutely essential that male callers to domestic violence helplines be screened to see if they are the perpetrator. That's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So in answer to your question about all these people who are fathers and all the rest, they are not in the system. They are not controlling the system. They don't want to know about it. And also, this is primarily against the working class, the poorer sections of society. The better off, the less of these agencies are involved. They can afford representation. You don't have so much dirt. Which is why there's such a high percentage of fatherlessness in the poorer boroughs. It's been driven by agencies who have vested interest in driving men out of the family.
And yet, you will hear social commentators bewailing the fact all the time that children who grow up in single-parent households with no dad around are at a disadvantage.
All the prison population, every statistic proves that. And then we're told that feckless dads and all the rest is the cause of so much breakdown in communities and all the rest, when there's a vast system at local authority level and national authority level that will only accept evidence from females in the removal of dads from the family home. Now, Nigeria, parental alienation applies to 95% of mothers, 5% of dads, because the men have control there, which I don't agree with. In the UK, it's the other way around. 95% of the non-resident parents are fathers, 5% are mothers. There's abuse either way. We have to get towards what I call gender-neutral impartial professionalism, to get away from what I call the current child endangering gender discrimination. This business of family breakdown years ago was estimated from the Centre for Social Justice as costing the UK taxpayer then £49 billion a year. That was 6-7 years ago. I assume it's 55 to 60 billion now. But there's only 2 or 3, 4 billion pounds worth of income derived by the professionals. But they protect it zealously. Then you have the entry system, because the entry determines the outcome for far too many. Most fathers, once uprooted from the family home, and ever since LASPO came in 2013, the amount of applications and awards have increased by a factor of 300%, citing domestic abuse. So you can only get legal aid if you cite domestic abuse. The gateway agencies are predominantly female, 95% only. So that straight away, the state is sponsoring the removal of fathers who are automatically deemed as perpetrators without a shred of evidence. I have never been cautioned, charged or convicted. Been interviewed by a policeman? Nothing. Broadly cleared in the finding of fact 3-day hearing on the civil courts. And most fathers I help, which used to be pre-COVID about 300 to 400 newcomers per year, have never been charged or cautioned or convicted.
Yep.
They've never seen a criminal court.
So the system is, you would say, weighted. I mean, consciously and deliberately weighted against the men.
Absolutely. So that is the problem as I see it, that we need to remove the extraordinary gender bias, the sickening gender bias, and move towards neutrality. And unless there's criminal evidence of a criminal standard against a parent of either side, and bear in mind, more children are killed by the mothers than by the fathers.
Yes.
See, yet the fathers are deemed the risk. That we need to move towards far less adversarial and more, I hate using the word holistic, but letting the children have proper relations with both parents and their wider families. Huge amount of grandmothers are not seeing their children.
If men and women are equal, why is it all right to discriminate against men but not against women? Someone who has studied the effects of positive discrimination is Martin Daubney, a former MEP and founder of the Men and Boys Coalition.
I mean, it's so manifest, it's difficult to know where to start. Let's start with education. So one of the big things I made my pioneering work in was the working class boys in Britain, especially the white working class boys, have been the bottom of education for 20 straight years. And that's from kindergarten to university, all the way through, irrespective of background, social class, poverty, single parents, you name it. Boys always fare worse and white boys fare the very worst. And yet, when we raised this with the charity, the Men and Boys Coalition, I wrote articles for the Times, the Sunday Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail. I was on ITV This Morning. I was on Sky News for years. I went to committee room meetings. I sat down with David Lammy. I sat down with numerous Conservatives. You put the data in front of them. They just weren't interested. They said, well, if we push back against this, we're expecting problems. And I was like, what are you talking about? The evidence is...
You've already got problems.
Yeah, the problem is there. And the data is here. Look, here it is. And more than that, we went around the world finding best practice in places like Sweden, in places like the Bronx in Sweden, that had a very proactive kind of attitude towards paternity leave for men. So there was some form of equity. So in the UK, you get 2 weeks off if you're a dad, on statutory minimum £122 a week. In Sweden, you get 80% full pay. It's like furlough for dads. And as a consequence, more men took an active role in parenthood. And so women were allowed to go back to work. It helped women. When we brought this evidence back to the UK, MPs like Jess Phillips and the usual suspects said, well, we don't want that. It's sexist. And you started to realise that institutionally and politically there was resistance everywhere to giving equality to men.
Let's move on from education for a moment towards where most people think of positive discrimination happening, which is in employment, and indeed in politics, for that matter, or women shortlists, which is an initiative of the Labour Party. And indeed the Conservative Party for a long time had a policy that you had to have an equal number of men and women on the shortlist, regardless of merit, and those are the crucial words, regardless of merit.
Yes.
Let's look at employment for a moment, quotas. You know, you must have X number of women on a board, you must have X number of women here and there. But for the man, that means that he begins at a disadvantage. Now, how does trying to eliminate one disadvantage by causing another disadvantage get us anywhere?
Well, it doesn't. It's more of the bad. It's the same old story. I remember I was talking about shared parenthood and fathers having more access to paternity leave, and I was invited into all the big corporate banks. I was a token bloke. I was in rooms full of the most powerful feminist women on the FTSE companies in Britain being told that men had privilege and advantage, and I was like, well, where are all the men? There aren't any men here.
Did you actually ask that?
I did.
And what was the answer?
They said, well, they run the FTSE 100. There are more men called John than women that run FTSE 100 companies. I was like, yeah, because what happens when you look at the data, and I got some data from HSBC Bank, they said globally, what happened was when people became parents, mothers typically worked less, and they were well paid to work less. So there were rich schemes to enable them to stay at home and be mothers, and the dads worked more hours, irrespective of cultural background, from India, Hong Kong, Asia, Australasia, UK, it was the same. And when I said to this room, hands up who went to a comprehensive like me, no hands went up. And they all went to better universities than me. My dad was a coal miner, but I was always told I have this thing called male privilege. And I said, well, when did that start? Because I don't remember that kicking in. And the trouble is, Anne, this idea that men are born privileged, especially white men, is so imbibed now, it's so endemic, that it's now become true. The patriarchy, the myth of the patriarchy. You know, my dad used to work 16 hours a day to support my mum. You know, she was a housewife and 2 kids. And that now has been reframed as oppression.
I'm looking at something very, very specific. I'm looking at saying, because there have been historically too few women, we are now going to institute a procedure whereby women are given special advantages. Now, I'm a 70s feminist, not a 90s feminist. I'm a 70s feminist. And I continually amaze the next generation down when I say to them, you know, when I graduated, it was perfectly lawful, I mean, utterly lawful, to have an advertisement for a job with 2 rates of pay underneath, one for men, one for women, was lawful.
And that's wrong.
But it was lawful. This is the point I'm making. Now, the 70s feminists said, we want a level playing field. We want total equality, and we will compete with the men, but we want to compete on the same basis. We don't want to start with these disadvantages. By the 90s, that had become, oh dear, we haven't made it on an equal playing field. We now want that playing field tilted towards us, and we want all women shortlists. We want quotas. Now, the instant you say you want an all-women shortlist, what you are saying in terms almost is a man cannot have this seat in Parliament, on the board, on whatever it may be. It's reserved. A man cannot have it, no matter how good he is, no matter how able he is, no matter how experienced he is, even if he's grown up in that constituency, brought his own children up in that constituency, doesn't matter. Now, imagine if it was the reverse.
Yeah, it would be.
Imagine if it was the reverse.
Yeah, so what basically happened is that a perception of historical inequality became a new inequality. I was meeting HR directors of really big companies who, after the presentations, we'd have a little glass of wine. They say to me, you know, I deal with so many men, middle-aged men now, who come and see me all the time, who tell me I can't get promoted. I've just hit this dead end. And they were being passed by at every opportunity by a female, an LGBT, a minority. And, you know, these conversations weren't being had in the mainstream media because, you know, you're racist and you're sexist. But it's happening. I'm contacted all the time by men who just can't get on because they just don't fit the current trend. And all-women shortlists are, I think, incredibly discriminatory. The BBC itself now, you know, won't hire, you know, men. It hires minorities. They specifically advertise for BAME candidates only as trainee journalists. Sky News now in London will not hire white people. It's part of their employment policy, and the same with men. It's a terrible time to be a man, and that sounds like, oh, you know, cry me a river. Every day is International Men's Day. But my point is that you don't address something that was wrong by reintroducing something that's also wrong. And the funny thing is about this, when you look at the most progressive countries around the world, let's look to Scandinavia. So Finland is a shining beacon of equality. They spent millions and millions, if not billions of euros advancing equality. So they put money into STEM, science and all that for women, and they encourage men to be teachers. They try to reverse, you know, generations of career choices. And actually what happened was the opposite of what they intended. And that is when you gave people more support in the form of state benefits if anything went wrong, and when you gave them free access to education, free childcare to support their career choices, it actually polarised the genders towards where they just were already. In fact, even more so. There were more male engineers and there were more female nurses and teachers, because guess what? If you allow people freedom of choice, they tend to go where they want to go. Caring professions, you know, the more kind of mathematical, process-driven career choices. And so you can spend an eternal amount of money trying to reverse this. Maybe that's just what people want to do. But I think men have just kind of been left behind. And one of the tragic consequences of that, of course, has been this sort of suicide epidemic. Fatherlessness is a huge issue.
Yes.
I did a huge amount of work into that. And when you look at the men in jails, 95% of jail inmates are men, and about 3/4 of those men tend to be coming from single-parent families, ostensibly where they grew up without a father. And so the whole conversation was about toxic masculinity, being a man is poisonous. But I started to say in the Telegraph when I was a columnist there, well, what about if positive male role models were around? Here's the evidence. You know, if there's a positive man in a child's life, they're much less likely to go to jail, to abuse drugs, to abuse alcohol, to have a criminal record, better educational outcomes. The evidence is there. And yet, the headwind of political discourse and media discourse is that men are bad. And it's incredibly damaging, you know, for men.
Well, why haven't men fought back?
I agree with that, but you must remember that now there's this huge headwind of the media. So the media are so bought into the notion of white male privilege, and that's because of academia. So downstream, you know, for all this time, these people are coming through an entire system where they believe in patriarchy, they believe in white male privilege, they believe in toxic masculinity as truth, as religion. It really is a religion, and to go against the religion is heresy, and people are shamed and excommunicated and tarred and feathered daily on social media, in their professional life. It's dangerous to put your head above the parapet and stick up for these things. Professionally and personally dangerous. As a consequence, we do have a generation of men that are quite meekly taking this. I do concur on that.
When one looks at things called the gender pay gap, I mean, a lot of it is because women tend to work part-time when they've got families, they take maternity leave, so they lose time at work. And whatever it may be, there are very, very good reasons why, if you're looking at averages, there's always going to be a gender pay gap.
Yeah, the gender pay gap is one of the biggest myths of our times. I mean, quite simply, if you look at all the variance across it, from hours worked, choice. Don't forget, you know, quite often women, as we said earlier, they choose to work in more caring, sharing professions, which typically tend to pay less. Look at teaching, look at nursing, as opposed to look at computing, look at engineering. And these are choices that people make. And the hours you have to work to get to the top are incredibly demanding. I know that. I worked in magazines, I got to the very top. And when I became a father, it didn't work for me. You know, 18 months after becoming a dad, I gave it all up because I didn't see my kid. That was my choice. But I wasn't supported financially. I worked for the world's biggest magazine corporation, IPC Media, Time Warner. And it was routine and normal for mothers to ask to go part-time after becoming a mother. And it had never been done before where a father asked to go part-time. My deputy editor asked to go part-time. Not only did they refuse him, but they laughed. This is the world's biggest magazine publisher. Well, we can't do that. He's deputy editor. If we make that position part-time, everybody will want to go part-time. I said, there are hundreds and hundreds of women that work in this company who have gone part-time, not a single man.
Women fought back against the injustices which they endured for so long. One only has to think of the suffragettes, then the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, and the subsequent arrival of the equal opportunities legislation. Yet there are many areas in which men suffer. John Barry is the co-author of Perspectives in Male Psychology, and he has looked at a number of indicators. But one of my most pressing questions is one of the most baffling. Why don't men make as much noise about their injustices as women would?
So, John, we've got 75% of all suicides are male. A third of all domestic violence cases are against males. Women overwhelmingly get access to children and custody in the family courts. Men are pursued by the CMS for arrears, sometimes based on calculations that are patently obviously wrong, and that pursuit can go on for years. And we have a situation in the employment market in which there can be quite active and overt discrimination in favour of women, or indeed of minorities in general. Yet men don't seem to be doing too much about it. What's going on?
That's a really interesting question. So there's so many bad things that are happening to men, but men don't seem to be doing very much about it. Partly might explain that. as being a traditional male stoicism. But I think that there might be more to it than that. I think there's a tendency for people to, in terms of group identities, for them to form in groups of people who are like themselves, and then favour people within that group. And then people who are unlike your identity, you'll tend to kind of work against them or even discriminate against them. And for almost all identities that you could think of, you will find that people form these in-groups and these out-groups. Interestingly, it doesn't work for the group identity of men. Men tend not to want to help other men under the identity of men. They might help other men under the identity of being, say, part of their platoon in the army, or being a Spurs friend, or a friend or anything like that. But this idea of men kind of working together to help each other because they're men, that doesn't pan out in reality at all. And there's plenty of research now that shows that. On the other hand, you'll find that women will pull together and they will help other women because they're women, and they will favour women over men because of the identity of being a woman.
What is the impact on a man, for example, of being told by a court that he can see his children every fortnight? And then the woman, in a breakup that's not amicable, then the woman decides, well, actually, she'll find an excuse and she'll thwart access and she'll thwart access and she'll thwart access. Now, we know that he's got very little legal recourse. He can keep going back to court, but all the court say is what should happen. They don't actually enforce the happening in the same way that they would with a man if they wanted to enforce, for example, supervised contact, they would. But they don't seem to enforce it with women. What is the psychological impact on a man in that position?
Devastating. So that there isn't a huge amount of evidence, and again, you might wonder why people aren't researching this sort of issue, but there's not a huge amount of research that goes into exploring the impact on men of not being able to access their children. But what research is there is really important. It does indicate that men's mental health takes a big hit. Suicide rate is definitely influenced by men having problems with the family courts and access to their children. And you could estimate, I think reasonably, about 20% of male suicides are due to family courts and restricted access to children. I think it's something that if more people were able to really take on board the impact that dads have when they're not able to see their children, I think that it might melt people's hearts a little bit, and there might be a little bit more empathy for them. But I think we tend to just think that, well, the mother is the right person for the children to be with, even if there's lots of evidence saying that the mother is unfit in a particular case. But also that the dad is just not seen as being the right sort of person to care for and tend for their children. And it's probably true that men and women do tend to have different parenting styles, but it doesn't mean that a man can't bring up his children or be extremely useful. Another way of looking at it, extremely useful for his children, for their dad to be in their life.
So, Ian, your son Gavin was being pursued by the Child Maintenance Service. What was his story?
Gavin had 3 children, which he was paying child maintenance for. He'd been paying the maintenance that was required. One he was paying through CMS. The other one he was paying through a court order. A few years ago, unbeknown to me, one of the wives instigated a financial investigation into Gavin's finances. Gavin used to talk to me about everything. We were like best buddies, and I went down to see him one weekend, the end of June, and on the next Wednesday following, Gavin disappeared. Nobody knew where he was. We flagged it up to the police that he was missing. The police put out searches for him, We had 3 days of not knowing where he was. On the Friday, the police discovered his body in a car 180 miles away from his home, and he basically used a disposable barbecue to commit suicide in the car.
How long had the CMS been involved with him?
Gavin had been involved with the CMS for about 15 years, first as a resident parent because he was bringing his son up from the age of 3 to the age of 13, first as a single parent, and then when he met somebody else he remarried. So he'd been involved with the CSA as it was, and then the CMS. He'd been trying to get child maintenance from the mother, but he never got a penny out of them. The CSA just weren't interested. As far as they were concerned, Gavin earned enough money to be able to look after his son on his own. At the age of 13, Gavin's eldest son decided he wanted to go and live with his mother. His decision, we don't really know why, but that's what he did. And at that point, Gavin and the mother of that child agreed a payment between the two of them of child maintenance. Gavin used the CMS calculator to agree that payment. And that went on for a few months. And for some reason, the mother decided that Gavin wasn't paying her enough, so she went to the CMS, and that's when he got involved, basically, with the CMS as it is now.
And what date was that?
Oh, I can't remember roughly.
A year roughly.
The year would have been, where are we, 2016, 17, something like that.
So, for several years,
Yeah.
the CMS were in contact with Gavin?
Yeah, for 3 years, Gavin would have been in contact with the CMS.
And they ended making an assessment that left him with what?
Yeah, we didn't know. I didn't know anything about all this stuff towards the end. Gavin didn't talk to me about it. It was only after we'd started going through his paperwork after he'd passed away that we found 3 letters from the CMS, one dated June 19, one dated May 20, and one dated in June 20. When I started looking through these letters, it just didn't make sense. I had to sit down and try and work out what was going on. So in these letters, basically it said that Gavin earned a basic wage of around £50,000 to £53,000 a year, which I know is right because I have Gavin's bank statements and his tax returns, all that sort of stuff. So that figure was correct. What wasn't correct, or what I couldn't figure out, was that the CMS had added an additional £26,000 income to Gavin's annual income.
So they were saying he was earning about 80,000.
Yeah, well, £76,000 was the exact figure that they came up with.
And they made an assessment on that basis.
Yes, yeah.
And what did that leave Gavin with?
Well, it wasn't just the £26,000 that was wrong. They'd come up with a arrears figure of £15,900 and something pounds. Now I know from all Gavin's bank statements, etc., that he'd been paying his child maintenance. You know, he wasn't an innocent. He did miss an occasional payment, but he had been paying it. I worked it out. In the last year of his life, he paid nearly £16,000 out in child maintenance for the 3 children. So I couldn't work out where this £15,000 arrears has come from. He's only been paying child maintenance for 1 child for 3 years. The other 2 children, he's paying through a court order. He pays £269 a week through a court order. So the CMS should not have been involved in that at all. The only thing they were involved with was the 1 child, and they'd somehow figured out this £15,000 arrears in 3 years for 1 child. So I couldn't figure that one out. And then when I was going through all the paperwork and trying to work it all out, the CMS were also chasing Gavin for child maintenance payments for the other 2 children of around about £1,000. It varied on all 3 letters. They kept changing the figure for that.
£1,000 a month?
A month, yeah. which would have been over and above the £269 a week that he was already paying. And when I sat down and put all the figures together about what they were expecting him to pay out, they were expecting him to pay out £2,669 a month in child maintenance, which would have left him having, I got his bank accounts and his wages and that, would have left him £153 a month to survive on. It wouldn't even have paid for his petrol to go to work.
So the summary of the situation is that over a number of years, he was dealing with the CMS. They changed the assessments. Yeah. They finally arrived at an assessment that wouldn't have left him enough to get to work on, let alone pay all his other expenses. He must surely have challenged that.
Yeah, I know he challenged it because the first letter would have been the initial assessment. That was back in 19. So it would have had an initial assessment back in 19. He will have challenged it, and they came back with another letter basically saying, we've looked at the figures and the figures are correct, you've got to pay it. He will have challenged it again because I have a third letter which ironically arrived the day after the police found his body, that said again that they looked at all the figures. As far as they were concerned, the figures were correct, and that was what they were expecting him to pay.
And is your view that the actions of the Child Maintenance Service over a period of time contributed towards his suicide?
Oh, definitely, yeah, definitely. There's no way out for him. How's he going to live? £153 a month. He's fought against the CMS. He's argued with the CMS. I know he has because he's talked to me at times about arguing with the CMS. And I've had dealings with the CMS since, and they are just intransigent. They will not listen. They don't care. Some of the phone conversations I've had with them are just horrendous. I'm his father, but they will not talk to me about anything. It's just, I can understand where he would have been once you get to that point where there is just no point in talking to anybody anymore. Nobody's listening to you. He had nowhere else to go. I've been fighting this case now for 14 months since I found out what was going on, and I've tried all sorts of people. I've written to you, I've written to MPs, I've written to my MP, I've written to DWP, I've put complaints in to the ICO, I've got a complaint in with the PHSO, I've got complaints in all over the place. I've done a couple of podcasts with various people. I've tried speaking to media people, but the media don't want to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about this, and I cannot figure out why. I don't know. I cannot figure out why they don't want to talk about it. It's this. I mean, I've done a lot of research since I lost Gavin into the CMS and the way they behave. They are just completely seem to be completely above the law. The stuff they do, the stuff they get away with, they can raid people's bank accounts. They put in DEOs on people, a lot of them all based on fictitious arrears and questionable figures, as in Gavin's case. And nobody seems to be interested in it at all. It's just crazy, all the stuff that's going on, and nobody wants to take any interest in it.
And do you think there would be interest taken if it was the women who were suffering like this?
Yeah, definitely, yeah, because you only have to look at some of the broadcasts that have gone out, and it's always the women's side that's put across. The men seem to be just completely ignored.
It's tough being a man, isn't it? Pursued by the Child Maintenance Service for money that you haven't got, and quite often for money that you don't even owe. Unable to see your own children. The court's completely ineffective when it comes to imposing their own orders if the ex-partner doesn't want the man to see his own children. Regarded as the perpetrator right from the very first minute of an allegation of rape or sexual assault, and quite regardless of whether the allegations stand up or not. The man is named, the woman is not. If the woman is shown to have acted through malice, she still isn't prosecuted. And then,
If a man simply wants to pursue a career on the same basis as a woman, he is thwarted by quotas and all-women shortlists. For decades now, we have regarded women as the victims in society. But it does appear as if the pendulum has really swung in the opposite direction. And now it's men who are the second-class citizens.